The mahogany desk where my grandfather Eduardo had taught me to balance ledgers and understand compound interest still smelled faintly of his cologne, even 6 months after his funeral. I sat in his leather chair, my chair now, staring at the bank statement that showed 50 million reais in my account. A number so large it seemed fictional despite having lived with Eduardo's wealth my entire 25 years. The doorbell's chime echoed through the colonial mansion in São Paulo's Jardins district, followed by voices I recognized but hadn't heard in person for over 3 years. My parents, Carlos and Isabela Monteiro, had finally come to visit their daughter, not to offer condolences for the grandfather who had raised me, not to comfort me in my grief, but to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. "Arianna, darling." Isabela's voice carried the practiced warmth of a stage actress, as Maria, our longtime housekeeper, led them into Eduardo's study. My mother looked exactly as I remembered. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair, designer clothing that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and eyes that calculated value before expressing emotion. "You look thin, sweetheart. Are you eating properly without Grandpa to take care of you?" The concern was hollow, performed for an audience of one who had learned years ago to recognize the difference between genuine care and social necessity. Carlos followed behind her, his expensive suit and Rolex watch testifying to the success of whatever business venture had currently captured his attention. Construction, I thought, or perhaps luxury real estate development in Florianopolis. "Hello, Carlos." "Isabela," I said, deliberately omitting the parental titles they had never earned through presence or care. "I'm surprised to see you here. It's been, 3 years since your last visit?" "We've been busy building our future, darling," Carlos said with the kind of jovial confidence that had always made me feel like an inconvenient detail in his life's grand plan. "But now that poor Eduardo is gone, God rest his soul, it's time for our family to come together and make some important decisions about our inheritance." Our inheritance. The presumption was breathtaking, as if Carlos had somehow earned a share of the wealth that Eduardo had built through decades of careful business decisions and strategic investments, while his son was off chasing get-rich-quick schemes that always seemed to require relocating to new cities where opportunities were supposedly more abundant. "What decisions would those be?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Isabela settled into the chair across from the desk, with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to making herself comfortable in other people's spaces. "Well, naturally, the inheritance will need to be divided properly between family members. We understand that Eduardo was fond of you, dear, but 50 million reais is far too much money for someone your age to manage responsibly. Carlos and I have experience with large-scale financial planning." The audacity was stunning. My parents, who had visited me perhaps a dozen times in 25 years, who had missed my high school graduation to attend a business conference in Miami, who had sent a fruit basket when I graduated summa cum laude from USP with degrees in business and economics, were now claiming expertise in managing the fortune that Eduardo had specifically left to me. "Actually," I said, opening the leather portfolio that contained Eduardo's will and the accompanying legal documents, "the inheritance has already been divided according to Eduardo's wishes. He left everything to me because I was the family member who chose to be part of his life." Carlos's jovial demeanor flickered slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "Arianna, sweetheart, you have to understand that parents have certain legal rights over their children's assets, especially when those assets come from family sources. We're not trying to be greedy. We're trying to be responsible." "Legal rights?" I repeated, letting the phrase hang in the air while I studied their faces. "That's interesting. Have you spoken with Eduardo's lawyers about these rights you believe you have?" "We don't need to speak with lawyers to know that parents are entitled to half of any inheritance their children receive," Isabela said, with the confidence of someone who had never actually researched inheritance law but was certain her assumptions must be correct. "It's only natural and fair." I reached for the second folder in Eduardo's portfolio, the one I hadn't opened until this moment, because I had hoped I would never need its contents. "Before we discuss fairness, there's something else you should probably know about Eduardo's estate planning." The sealed envelope was addressed to me in Eduardo's careful handwriting, to be opened only if Carlos and Isabela attempt to claim inheritance rights. I had found it 3 days after the funeral, tucked inside his desk drawer along with a note that said simply, "Minha querida Arianna, I pray you will never need this, but if you do, remember that love is the only inheritance that truly matters." I broke the wax seal and unfolded documents that would change my parents' lives forever. The first page was stamped with the seal of Eduardo's law firm and dated 15 years earlier. Notice of disinheritance and property eviction. Carlos Eduardo Montero and Isabela Santos Montero. What is that? Carlos asked, his voice suddenly tight with something that might have been fear. I looked up at my parents. These strangers who had contributed DNA but never presence, money but never time, expectations but never support, and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but definitely wasn't sadness. Your eviction notice, I said simply. You have 30 days to leave all properties currently registered in your names. Eduardo disinherited you 15 years ago for child neglect, and apparently, he's been letting you live in his buildings out of charity rather than obligation. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Isabela's designer purse hitting the marble floor. The photo albums in Eduardo's study told the story that my parents had never bothered to learn. 25 years of birthday parties, school plays, piano recitals, graduation ceremonies, and quiet Sunday afternoons where a grandfather and granddaughter built a relationship based on presents rather than promises. Each carefully mounted photograph was a testament to the man who had chosen to be my parent, when his own son had chosen everything else instead. Your papai was always too busy chasing dreams in other cities, Eduardo had told me when I was 8 years old, and asking why other children had fathers who came to their school performances. But I am here, Minha Flor, and I will always be here. Eduardo Montero had built his fortune through textile manufacturing, starting with a single factory in São Paulo's industrial district and expanding into luxury fabrics that supplied high-end fashion houses throughout Brazil and Argentina. By the time I was born, his company employed 3,000 people and generated annual revenues that made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. But wealth had never been the point. Work was his meditation, success was his responsibility, and family was his purpose. Business is just mathematics with human faces, he would explain, while teaching me to read financial statements at the kitchen table, where we ate breakfast together every morning for 17 years. You must understand the numbers, yes, but more importantly, you must understand the people behind the numbers. Employees have families to feed, customers have needs to fill, competitors have their own struggles. Success comes from helping everyone win something, even if you win more. The philosophy had shaped his approach to everything, including the careful way he had managed my relationship with my absent parents. Eduardo never spoke badly of Carlos and Isabela in my presence, never poisoned me against them, or tried to turn their abandonment into loyalty for him. Instead, he simply filled the space they had left empty, providing stability and love so consistent that I rarely felt the absence of what I had never really had. Mama and Papa are very busy people, he would say, when I asked why they missed another birthday or Christmas celebration. They have important work that takes them far from home. But you have me, and I have you, and together, we are a complete family. The completeness had been real and sustaining. Eduardo attended every parent-teacher conference, cheered at every soccer game during my brief athletic phase, drove me to friends' houses, and picked me up from sleepovers with the reliable presence that other children took for granted from their parents. When I showed interest in piano, he hired the best teacher in São Paulo. When I struggled with advanced mathematics, he sat with me every evening until the concepts became clear. Education is the only inheritance that cannot be stolen, he would say, while reviewing my homework or helping me prepare for university entrance exams. Money can disappear, buildings can burn, businesses can fail, but knowledge becomes part of who you are forever. His pride in my academic achievements was genuine and infectious. My acceptance letter to the University of São Paulo was framed and hung in his office alongside his business awards and civic recognition. My economics thesis on sustainable manufacturing practices was bound in leather and displayed on his bookshelf between biographies of business leaders and collections of Brazilian poetry. You understand things that took me 40 years to learn, he told me after reading my analysis of supply chain ethics in textile manufacturing. The next generation will be wiser than ours, and the world will be better for it. The summers when I worked in his factory weren't nepotism disguised as education. Eduardo made me earn my positions, starting with basic administrative tasks, and gradually taking on more responsibility as I proved my competence. The workers who had known me since childhood watched me learn every aspect of the business, from fabric dyeing to quality control to customer relations. She has her grandfather's mind, but also his heart, I overheard floor supervisor Rosa telling a new employee during my final summer before university. The family business will be safe with this one. Eduardo had been preparing me to inherit his empire since I was old enough to count, not because of bloodline obligations, but because I was the family member who had shown up, who had cared, who had chosen to be present in his life, rather than viewing him as a resource to be exploited when convenient. "Wealth is responsibility, Arianna," he had told me on my 21st birthday, while transferring the first million reais into an account in my name. "Those who have much must do much. Money that sits idle is money that fails its purpose. Use it wisely, use it kindly, and remember that the greatest investment is always in other people's potential." The lessons had shaped my understanding of what I was inheriting. This wasn't just money, or property, or business assets. It was the culmination of Eduardo's life's work, his values made tangible, his love transformed into resources that could make the world better. My parents saw 50 million reais as wealth to be enjoyed. I saw it as Eduardo's final gift of trust, that I would continue the work he had started. The responsibility was sacred, and I would not let them diminish it. The pattern of Carlos and Isabela's disappearances had been as predictable as São Paulo's afternoon thunderstorms throughout my childhood. Intense bursts of presence followed by long periods of absence, justified by increasingly elaborate explanations about opportunities that required their immediate attention in distant cities. By the time I turned 10, I had stopped expecting consistency and learned to treasure Eduardo's reliable love instead. "Papai has a brilliant new business idea," Isabela would announce during their brief visits, her voice carrying the breathless excitement of someone perpetually convinced that the next venture would be the one that finally delivered the lifestyle she deserved. "There's a luxury resort development opportunity in Búzios that could make us millions. We'll be back once everything is established." The resort development, like the organic coffee plantation in Minas Gerais, the eco-tourism venture in the Amazon, and the artisanal cachaça distillery in Bahia, had eventually collapsed due to what Carlos would later describe as market timing issues or partner reliability problems. The pattern was always the same: initial enthusiasm, significant investment of time and Eduardo's money, followed by gradual deterioration and eventual abandonment as newer opportunities captured their attention. "Your parents are dreamers," Eduardo would explain to me during one of their extended absences, his voice carrying compassion rather than criticism. "Dreams are beautiful things, but they require wisdom to become reality. Carlos has my entrepreneurial spirit, but not my patience for building slowly and carefully." What Eduardo never said, but what I began to understand as I grew older, was that Carlos and Isabela's dream chasing was really an elaborate form of escapism. They were fleeing the mundane responsibilities of parenthood, marriage, and steady work in favor of the exciting possibility that somewhere else, with some different venture, they could become the glamorous, wealthy, carefree people they believed they were meant to be. The evidence of their true priorities was visible in every choice they made. When I was 12 and needed surgery to repair a broken arm from a playground accident, they were in Recife launching a boutique hotel that would cater to European tourists seeking authentic Brazilian experiences. When I graduated valedictorian from high school, they were in Manaus developing an eco-lodge that would offer luxury accommodations deep in the rainforest. "We wanted to be there, darling, but the investors were only available that weekend," Isabela had explained over a crackling phone connection, her voice barely audible over background music that suggested their business meeting was taking place at some kind of party. "You understand how important this opportunity is for our family's future." The family's future, as they defined it, apparently didn't require their presence during any of the milestones that actually constituted my childhood and adolescence. They missed my first communion, my sweet 16 party, my high school graduation, and my acceptance to university. Each absence was explained with increasingly creative justifications about timing conflicts and unmissable opportunities. Yet they never missed opportunities to request financial support from Eduardo when their latest ventures encountered what Carlos euphemistically called cash flow challenges. The requests always came with detailed business plans and projected returns on investment, as if Eduardo's support was a loan rather than charity, and as if their track record suggested any likelihood of repayment. "The eco-lodge concept is revolutionary," Carlos had explained during one of their rare visits when I was 15, spreading architectural drawings and financial projections across Eduardo's dining room table, with the enthusiasm of someone who had forgotten that his previous revolutionary concepts had all ended in bankruptcy. "We're creating sustainable luxury that will attract environmentally conscious travelers who are willing to pay premium prices for authentic experiences." Eduardo would listen to these presentations with patient attention, ask thoughtful questions about market analysis and operational planning, and eventually write checks that kept Carlos and Isabela's dreams alive for another few months. But the money always came with conditions that revealed Eduardo's true understanding of his son's character. "The funds will be released through a trust account managed by my lawyers," Eduardo would say, his tone businesslike rather than paternal. "Expenses must be documented and approved, and if the venture fails to meet projected milestones, any remaining funds will be redirected to other family investments." The conditions were protection rather than punishment, Eduardo's way of ensuring that Carlos and Isabela's enthusiasm didn't result in complete financial disaster. But they were also evidence that Eduardo no longer trusted his son to make responsible decisions with family resources. "Your grandfather doesn't understand modern business principles," Isabela would complain to me during phone calls where she sought support for their latest request for funding. "He's too conservative, too focused on traditional approaches. We need flexibility to respond to changing market conditions." But I had been learning Eduardo's traditional approaches since childhood, and I could see what Carlos and Isabela couldn't. Their ventures failed not because Eduardo's support was too restrictive, but because their planning was too superficial. They were in love with the idea of being entrepreneurs, rather than committed to the discipline of building sustainable businesses. Now, sitting in Eduardo's study while they demanded half of the inheritance they had done nothing to earn, I finally understood that Carlos and Isabela hadn't been absent from my life by accident. They had been absent by choice, pursuing dreams that were more important to them than the daughter they had left behind. The textile empire that Eduardo had built from nothing was more than just a business. It was a living testament to the power of patient ambition and ethical leadership that had shaped every aspect of my understanding of success. Walking through the main factory in São Paulo's industrial district, I could feel the pride that 3,000 employees took in being part of something larger than their individual jobs. They were craftspeople creating beauty, providers supporting families, and stakeholders in a company that treated them as partners rather than expenses. Señor Eduardo always said that our hands create the fabric, but our hearts create the quality, explained Dona Carmen, the floor supervisor who had worked for the company for 37 years and had known me since I was a toddler, accompanying Eduardo on his daily factory visits. He understood that beautiful textiles require more than machines and materials. They require people who believe in what they're making. Eduardo had started the company in 1965 with a single industrial sewing machine and a contract to produce basic cotton fabric for a local clothing manufacturer. The early years were brutal: 18-hour workdays, constant financial pressure, and the kind of uncertainty that comes with building something from nothing while supporting a young family. But Eduardo possessed the rare combination of technical skill and business acumen that allowed him to recognize opportunities that others missed. "The secret was never trying to compete on price alone," he had told me while reviewing the company's early financial records, yellowed ledgers that documented the careful progression from survival to stability to success. "Anyone can make cheap fabric, but making fabric that lasts, that feels beautiful against the skin, that holds color after years of washing, that requires expertise that customers will pay for." The expertise had been developed through systematic investment in both technology and training. While competitors focused on maximizing short-term profits, Eduardo reinvested earnings into newer equipment, better materials, and comprehensive education programs that transformed factory workers into skilled artisans. The approach took longer to show results, but the results were sustainable in ways that purely profit-driven strategies could never match. By 1980, Eduardo's company was supplying high-end fashion houses throughout Brazil with fabrics that rivaled European imports in quality, while offering competitive pricing due to local production advantages. By 1990, the company was exporting to Argentina, Chile, and Mexico, with a reputation for reliability and innovation that made Eduardo's fabrics sought after throughout Latin America. "Your grandfather revolutionized Brazilian textile manufacturing," Dr. Helena Santos, my economics professor at USP, had explained when I wrote my senior thesis on sustainable business practices in traditional industries. He proved that emerging market companies could compete on quality rather than just cost, creating value for customers, employees, and shareholders simultaneously. The success had made Eduardo wealthy, but wealth had been a byproduct rather than the primary goal. The primary goal had always been building something worthwhile, a business that created good jobs, produced excellent products, and contributed positively to the communities where it operated. The company's charitable foundation funded education programs, healthcare initiatives, and small business development projects throughout São Paulo state. Money is a tool, not a destination, Eduardo would say when reviewing foundation budgets and discussing funding priorities. The purpose of financial success is creating opportunities for others to succeed as well. Wealth that doesn't circulate becomes stagnant, like water in a closed pool. The philosophy had guided every major decision Eduardo made about the company's growth and development. When competitors began moving production to countries with lower labor costs, Eduardo invested in automation and worker training that allowed his factories to remain competitive while maintaining employment in Brazil. When environmental regulations created new compliance costs, Eduardo pioneered eco-friendly manufacturing processes that eventually became industry standards. Senor Eduardo saw challenges as invitations to innovate, explained Roberto Alves, the company's chief engineer who had worked closely with Eduardo for 25 years. Other companies asked, "How can we avoid these new requirements?" He asked, "How can we exceed these requirements while creating competitive advantages?" The innovative approach had made Eduardo's company a model for sustainable manufacturing practices throughout Latin America. Business schools used his strategies as case studies. Government officials consulted him about industrial policy, and younger entrepreneurs sought his mentorship for their own ventures. But Eduardo's proudest achievement wasn't the recognition or financial success. It was the family of employees who had built careers and supported their children's educations through the stable, well-paying jobs his company provided. "Look at Maria's daughter," Eduardo would say, pointing to one of the many factory workers whose families had benefited from his company's success. "She's studying medicine at USP because her mother could afford the preparation courses and application fees. That's worth more than any profit margin." The company that I was inheriting wasn't just a source of wealth. It was a responsibility to continue the work that Eduardo had started, to maintain the standards he had established, and to honor the trust that thousands of families had placed in his leadership. The 50 million reais in my bank account was just one measure of what Eduardo had built. The real inheritance was the knowledge, values, and relationships that would allow me to continue his legacy. My parents saw only the money. They had never understood that Eduardo's true wealth lay in the lives he had touched and the community he had created around his work. The law offices of Silva, Rodriguez, and Associados occupied the entire 15th floor of a glass tower in São Paulo's financial district, with views of the city that Eduardo had helped shape through decades of business leadership and philanthropic investment. Dr. Patricia Silva, Eduardo's longtime attorney and trusted advisor, had requested this meeting to discuss additional provisions of the estate that require immediate attention, language that had sent ice through my veins when she called 2 days after my parents' shocking visit. "Arianna, I'm sorry to have to discuss these matters so soon after your loss," Dr. Silva began, her voice carrying the careful precision that had made her one of Brazil's most respected estate attorneys. "But given your parents' recent visit and their apparent intentions regarding the inheritance, it's time you understood the full scope of Eduardo's final arrangements." She opened a legal folder that was significantly thicker than the will I had already reviewed, containing documents that dated back 15 years and bore official seals from courts, banks, and government agencies. The first document was titled Formal Disinheritance Decree, and contained language that made my stomach clench with its clinical description of parental failures. Eduardo began documenting his concerns about Carlos and Isabela's parenting in 2008, Dr. Silva explained, pulling out a chronological file of photographs, medical records, school reports, and written testimonies. The evidence shows a pattern of child neglect that met the legal criteria for disinheritance under Brazilian family law. The photographs were the most damning evidence. Images of me at various ages, looking thin and unkempt, during periods when my parents had temporary custody, contrasted with pictures showing healthy weight and grooming when I was living with Eduardo. The medical records documented several instances where I had been brought to the hospital by Eduardo rather than my parents, including the broken arm incident when Carlos and Isabela were unreachable in Recife. The school reports were what convinced the family court judge, Dr. Silva continued, showing me documentation from my elementary school, describing irregular attendance, insufficient lunch money, and a general lack of parental engagement during periods when Carlos and Isabela were supposed to be caring for me. Your teachers noted that you were consistently more prepared and better cared for when your grandfather was your primary caregiver. The legal process had been complex and lengthy, requiring multiple court hearings, social worker evaluations, and psychological assessments that documented the impact of my parents' inconsistent care on my emotional development. Eduardo had pursued disinheritance not out of anger or revenge, but from genuine concern that Carlos and Isabela would eventually abandon me entirely unless legal consequences forced them to acknowledge their responsibilities. Eduardo hoped that the disinheritance proceedings would motivate Carlos and Isabela to become more involved parents, Dr. Silva explained. The court gave them multiple opportunities to demonstrate improved commitment to your well-being. They failed to meet any of the benchmarks established by the Family Services Department. The benchmarks had been reasonable requirements for responsible parenting, maintaining stable residence in São Paulo for at least 6 months per year, attending parent-teacher conferences, keeping regular medical appointments, and providing documentation of their financial stability. Carlos and Isabela had treated these requirements as unnecessary bureaucratic obstacles rather than fundamental aspects of child welfare. The final decree was signed in 2009, Dr. Silva said, showing me the judge's ruling that formally removed Carlos and Isabela from Eduardo's inheritance and granted him full legal custody of me. However, Eduardo chose not to inform them of the disinheritance immediately. He hoped they would eventually mature into more responsible parents without legal pressure. Instead of informing Carlos and Isabela of their disinheritance, Eduardo had continued providing financial support for their various business ventures, while quietly restructuring his estate to protect my inheritance from their potential claims. The properties they were living in, the luxury apartment in Ipanema, the beach house in Florianopolis, the small farm in the interior, were all technically owned by Eduardo's estate and managed through a trust that provided them with rent-free accommodation as charity rather than inheritance rights. Eduardo's generosity was extraordinary, Dr. Silva observed, reviewing the financial records that documented 15 years of continued support despite Carlos and Isabela's legal removal from the family fortune. He spent approximately 2 million reais supporting their lifestyle and business ventures after they had already been disinherited for child neglect. The revelation was staggering in its implications. My parents had been living on Eduardo's charity, while believing they were entitled to his wealth, pursuing dreams funded by money they had no legal right to receive, building lifestyles supported by a man whose grandchild they had abandoned to chase opportunities that always seemed more important than parenthood. Why didn't Eduardo tell them? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Because he loved his son despite everything, Dr. Silva replied with the sad wisdom that comes from decades of handling family disputes. Eduardo hoped that Carlos would eventually recognize his mistakes and choose to be a better father. He didn't want money to be the reason for reconciliation, but he also couldn't bear to see them struggle financially. The legal documents contained one final surprise, a provision that activated automatically if Carlos and Isabela attempted to claim inheritance rights. The moment they demanded half of my inheritance, they triggered the termination of their charitable housing arrangements and the beginning of a 30-day eviction process. They have until the end of next month to vacate all properties, Dr. Silva concluded, her voice carrying no satisfaction despite the justice of the outcome. Eduardo's final gift to you was ensuring that you would never have to share your inheritance with people who chose money over love. The private investigator's reports that Dr. Silva handed me painted a devastating portrait of the parents I had spent 25 years making excuses for, documenting patterns of neglect and abandonment that were far worse than my childhood memories had preserved. Eduardo had commissioned these investigations not to build a legal case against his son, but to understand why Carlos and Isabela consistently chose everything except their daughter when faced with decisions about time, attention, and priorities. Your grandfather was hoping to find evidence that would explain their behavior in ways that might lead to reconciliation, Dr. Silva explained while I reviewed photographs and testimonies that shattered my last illusions about parental love being complicated, but ultimately genuine. Instead, he discovered that their neglect was far more deliberate than anyone had realized. The reports detailed incidents I had forgotten or repressed. The time Carlos and Isabela left me with neighbors for 3 weeks, while they pursued a time-sensitive business opportunity in Rio de Janeiro, telling the neighbors it would be 3 days, the Christmas when I was 9, and they promised to return from their latest venture to celebrate with me, but instead sent a gift card and a note, explaining that their travel plans had changed due to unexpected developments. Most damaging were the recorded conversations between Carlos and Isabela, captured by the investigator during their brief returns to São Paulo when they believed they were speaking privately. The transcripts revealed parents who viewed me as an obligation that interfered with their freedom, rather than a daughter who deserved their love and attention. The child is Eduardo's responsibility now. Isabela's voice was quoted as saying, during a 2010 conversation with Carlos about whether to attend my middle school graduation. He wanted custody. Let him handle the boring parental duties. We have more important things to focus on than sitting through some tedious school ceremony. The more important things were consistently related to their business ventures, social opportunities, or personal desires that ranked higher than my emotional needs. When I won a regional science fair competition at age 13, they were attending a luxury resort opening in Buzios, where they hoped to network with potential investors. When I was hospitalized with pneumonia at 15, they were in Argentina exploring export opportunities for their latest failed enterprise. Eduardo tried to shield you from understanding how deliberate their choices were, Dr. Silva said, showing me bank records that documented Eduardo hiring private tutors, therapists, and mentors to fill the gaps left by my parents' absence. He didn't want you to know that they were choosing to miss your milestones, not just accidentally missing them due to bad timing. The financial records revealed another layer of callousness. Carlos and Isabela had been using my name on tax documents and business registrations to claim dependent deductions and family business benefits, while contributing nothing to my actual care or education. They had essentially been profiting financially from my existence while refusing to accept responsibility for my well-being. They claimed you as a business dependent for tax purposes while you were living with Eduardo full-time, Dr. Silva explained, showing me documents that made my stomach turn with their cynical manipulation of family relationships for financial gain. They were receiving government benefits for supporting a child they had abandoned to your grandfather's care. The investigation had also uncovered the truth about their repeated requests for money from Eduardo. Rather than legitimate business investments that encountered unexpected challenges, most of their ventures were elaborate lifestyle funding mechanisms designed to support their desires for luxury travel, expensive social circles, and the appearance of wealth without the discipline of actually building sustainable enterprises. The Eco Lodge in Manaus never existed, Dr. Silva said, showing me the investigators' report on Carlos and Isabela's supposed environmental tourism venture. They spent the money Eduardo gave them on a 3-month vacation at luxury resorts throughout the Amazon region, then claimed the project had failed due to regulatory complications. The pattern repeated across multiple supposed business ventures. The artisanal cachaça distillery that was actually an expensive bar-hopping tour through Brazil's interior. The organic coffee plantation that was a luxury ecotourism experience in Minas Gerais. The boutique hotel in Recife that was simply an extended stay at competitors' properties while they enjoyed regional nightlife and cuisine. Your grandfather knew, Dr. Silva said quietly. He knew they were lying about the business ventures, knew they were using you for tax benefits while abandoning their parental responsibilities, knew they were treating his financial support as funding for lifestyles they hadn't earned. But he continued supporting them because cutting them off meant admitting that his son had chosen to be a bad father. The revelation was devastating because it transformed my understanding of my entire childhood. I had spent years believing that Carlos and Isabela were absent due to unfortunate timing and demanding work schedules, when the truth was that they had systematically chosen their comfort and pleasure over their daughter's emotional needs. Eduardo documented everything because he wanted you to understand, when you were old enough, that their absence wasn't your fault, Dr. Silva said, her voice gentle with the recognition that these truths would forever change how I understood my family. He wanted you to know that you deserved better than they were willing to give, and that their failures reflected their character, not your worth. The hidden cruelties had been protected by Eduardo's love and my own willingness to make excuses for parents who didn't deserve the benefit of doubt. But now, facing their demands for half of the inheritance they had forfeited through neglect, I finally understood that their current behavior was consistent with patterns established decades earlier. They hadn't come to comfort me in grief. They had come to collect money they thought was owed to them for the burden of having produced me. The formal eviction notices were delivered to Carlos and Isabela's 3 properties simultaneously at exactly 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, carried by court officers who had strict instructions to document the delivery process with photographs and witness signatures. I watched from my office window as similar scenes played out across the city. The Ipanema apartment where they entertained their social circle, the beach house in Florianopolis where they hosted weekend parties, and the interior farm where they played at being rural landowners when city life became tiresome. The legal requirements have been satisfied, Dr. Silva reported, after receiving confirmation from all 3 locations. Carlos and Isabela have been formally notified that they have 30 days to vacate the properties and remove all personal belongings. After that date, any remaining items will be considered abandoned and disposed of accordingly. The phone calls began within hours of the delivery, first from Carlos with his voice tight with panic, then from Isabela alternating between rage and desperate pleading, then from both of them together as they tried to coordinate a response to what they clearly believed was some kind of administrative error that could be corrected through proper explanation. "Arianna, darling, there's been a terrible mistake," Isabela's voice crackled through the phone line, her usual polished composure replaced by barely controlled hysteria. "Some court officers came to the apartment claiming we have to leave, but that's impossible. This apartment has been our primary residence for 12 years. Eduardo would never have evicted his own son." "Eduardo didn't evict you," I replied calmly, reviewing the legal documents that made their situation perfectly clear. "Eduardo died 6 months ago. The current property owner is his estate, which I control as sole heir, and according to the records, you have never been tenants or owners of any of these properties. You've been living in them as charity recipients." The silence that followed was broken only by muffled conversation, as Isabela apparently covered the phone to consult with Carlos about how to respond to information that contradicted their fundamental assumptions about their living arrangements. "That's ridiculous!" Carlos's voice came through more clearly as he apparently took the phone from his wife. "We've invested thousands of reais in improvements to these properties over the years. We've treated them as our own, because Eduardo always assured us that they would be part of our inheritance. You can't just throw us out like common renters." "Actually, I can," I said, feeling a strange sense of peace at finally being able to state truths that had been hidden by Eduardo's compassionate deception. "You were disinherited 15 years ago for child neglect. Everything you've been living in, everything you've been using, everything you've been assuming was yours. It all belongs to me now, and I no longer choose to provide it as charity." The explosion of protests, accusations, and demands that followed was predictable, but exhausting. Carlos and Isabela cycled through denial. The disinheritance papers must be forgeries. Anger, "You're destroying our family out of spite." Bargaining, "Surely we can reach some reasonable compromise." And desperate promises, "We'll be better parents. We'll visit more often. We'll make up for lost time." "It's too late for better parenting," I said when their arguments finally ran out of energy. "I'm 25 years old. The time for you to choose to be my parents was 25 years ago, not 25 days before you lose the properties you thought you were inheriting." Dr. Silva had warned me that the 30-day eviction period would likely include increasingly desperate attempts at reconciliation, as Carlos and Isabela faced the reality of losing the lifestyle they had built on Eduardo's charity. The attempts began the next day with flowers delivered to my office, followed by handwritten letters expressing newfound appreciation for my intelligence and character, then by promises to establish trust funds for future grandchildren they hoped I might provide. "We realize now how much we missed during your childhood," Isabela wrote, in a letter that arrived along with an expensive jewelry box that I suspected had been purchased with credit rather than cash. "We were so focused on building financial security for our family's future that we didn't appreciate the wonderful daughter we already had. Please give us another chance to show you how much we love you." The letters were accompanied by flowers, gifts, and surprise visits, where Carlos and Isabela demonstrated levels of parental concern and interest that would have been touching if they had appeared at any point during the previous 25 years. But their sudden attention felt like the business presentations they used to make to Eduardo, carefully choreographed performances designed to achieve specific financial outcomes rather than genuine expressions of familial affection. "They're trying to manipulate you the same way they manipulated Eduardo," Dr. Silva observed, when I showed her the letters and described their increasingly frequent visits. "They're hoping that emotional appeals will override your legal authority and their documented history of neglect." The manipulation attempts escalated as the 30-day deadline approached. Carlos arrived at my office with architectural drawings for renovations he wanted to make to our family properties as proof of his long-term commitment. Isabela brought photo albums documenting the few occasions when they had been present during my childhood, emphasizing their deep emotional connection that supposedly justified continued housing support. "We're not asking for money," Carlos said during one particularly elaborate presentation about their future plans for family involvement. "We're just asking for time to transition to new living arrangements. 30 days isn't enough to find suitable accommodations and arrange proper relocations." But the investigation Dr. Silva had conducted into their current financial situation revealed that Carlos and Isabela had resources for relocation. They simply preferred to spend their money on luxury travel and entertainment, rather than housing costs that cut into their disposable income. They could afford market-rate apartments, Dr. Silva reported. They just don't want to reduce their lifestyle to accommodate the reality that Eduardo's charity has ended. The 30 days would pass regardless of their preferences, and for the first time in their adult lives, Carlos and Isabela would face consequences for prioritizing their desires over their responsibilities. With 2 weeks remaining until their eviction deadline, Carlos and Isabela's strategy shifted from emotional appeals to legal warfare, hiring expensive attorneys who specialized in inheritance disputes, and began filing challenges to every aspect of Eduardo's estate planning. The lawsuits arrived at Dr. Silva's office like artillery shells, each one targeting different elements of the legal framework that protected my inheritance from their claims. They're challenging the disinheritance on grounds of mental incompetence, Dr. Silva explained while reviewing the first wave of legal documents that Carlos and Isabela's lawyers had filed with São Paulo's family court. They claim Eduardo was suffering from dementia or other cognitive impairments that made him susceptible to manipulation when he excluded them from the inheritance. The mental competence challenge was both predictable and doomed to failure, given the extensive documentation of Eduardo's sharp business acumen right up until his death 6 months earlier. Bank records showed sophisticated investment decisions. Board meeting minutes revealed strategic thinking that had impressed fellow CEOs, and medical records from his final physical examination confirmed normal cognitive function for a man his age. Eduardo anticipated this challenge, Dr. Silva said, pulling out a sealed envelope marked Cognitive Assessment Documentation from Eduardo's legal files. He underwent comprehensive psychological and neurological evaluation 3 years ago, specifically to prevent posthumous claims of mental incompetence. The evaluation results were devastating to Carlos and Isabela's legal strategy. Eduardo had tested in the superior range for memory, reasoning, and decision-making abilities, with no evidence of cognitive decline that might affect his judgment about family relationships or financial planning. The evaluating physician had specifically noted Eduardo's exceptional clarity regarding family dynamics and inheritance priorities. But the mental competence challenge was only the opening move in a legal campaign that targeted every aspect of my inheritance. Carlos and Isabela's attorneys filed claims alleging that Eduardo's will was improperly witnessed, that the disinheritance process violated their constitutional rights as natural heirs, and that I had exercised undue influence over an elderly man to manipulate his estate planning decisions. The undue influence claim is particularly offensive, I told Dr. Silva after reading through accusations that painted my childhood relationship with Eduardo as a calculated campaign to turn him against his son and daughter-in-law. They're claiming I manipulated Eduardo by being present in his life while they were absent pursuing business opportunities. The legal documents portrayed my academic achievements, business education, and work in Eduardo's company as evidence of a scheme to position myself as his favorite while deliberately excluding Carlos and Isabela from family involvement. According to their lawyers, my presence during Eduardo's final years had been strategically calculated to ensure maximum inheritance at their expense. They're arguing that your educational success and business competence were forms of manipulation rather than genuine accomplishments, Dr. Silva observed with disgust evident in her voice. Essentially, they claim Eduardo was tricked into believing you were more worthy of inheritance than they were. The undue influence argument required Carlos and Isabela to admit in legal documents that they had been absent from Eduardo's life for extended periods, but they reframed their absences as evidence that I had systematically excluded them from family relationships through jealousy and calculation. Their business ventures were portrayed as noble attempts to build wealth for the family's benefit, while my education and career development were characterized as selfish attention-seeking that exploited Eduardo's loneliness. According to their legal theory, Dr. Silva said with barely concealed contempt, Carlos and Isabela were the victims of a conspiracy between you and Eduardo to defraud them of their rightful inheritance through the manipulation of an isolated elderly man. The lawsuits were accompanied by a public relations campaign designed to pressure me through social embarrassment. Carlos and Isabela began telling friends and extended family members that I was stealing their inheritance through legal technicalities, portraying themselves as devastated parents whose ungrateful daughter was destroying the family over money disputes. People are calling me, reported my cousin Marina, who had maintained relationships with both sides of the family conflict. Tia Isabela says you've changed since getting all that money, that you've become cold and vindictive. She's telling everyone that you're throwing your own parents out of their homes because you want to keep everything for yourself. The narrative was compelling to people who didn't understand the full history. Loving parents destroyed by their daughter's greed, an inheritance dispute that could have been resolved through family compromise if only the younger generation were willing to share. Carlos and Isabela were skilled at presenting themselves as victims of circumstances beyond their control, rather than architects of their own consequences. But the most desperate move came when they attempted to claim legal guardianship over me, filing court documents that argued I was psychologically unstable due to grief over Eduardo's death, and therefore incompetent to manage the large inheritance I had received. The guardianship petition requested that the court place Eduardo's estate under Carlos and Isabela's management, until my mental health could be properly evaluated and treated. This is their final strategy, Dr. Silva explained with anger that matched my own. If they can't inherit the money directly, they want to control it through legal guardianship, while you undergo psychiatric evaluation that could take months or years to resolve. The guardianship petition was based on testimony from distant relatives and family friends who reported that I seemed withdrawn and changed since Eduardo's death, combined with their own sworn statements about my alleged inability to handle financial stress and family conflicts appropriately. With 10 days left until eviction, Carlos and Isabela were willing to destroy their daughter's reputation and legal autonomy, rather than accept the consequences of 25 years of parental neglect. The last week before eviction brought increasingly frantic attempts at reconciliation, mixed with escalating threats of legal and social destruction, as Carlos and Isabela ricocheted between desperate affection and barely controlled rage depending on which strategy seemed most likely to preserve their housing arrangements. They appeared at my office, my home, and even my gym, with the unpredictable intensity of people watching their comfortable lives disintegrate in real time. Arianna, my darling daughter, Isabela appeared at my apartment door at 7 a.m. on Monday, holding coffee and pastries from the expensive bakery she had frequented during years of living rent-free in Eduardo's properties. I brought your favorite breakfast, so we could talk like mother and daughter, instead of like adversaries in some legal dispute. The pastries were indeed from my favorite bakery, but Isabela's knowledge of my preferences was recent research rather than maternal familiarity. She had never brought me breakfast before, never visited my apartment before, never appeared at my door with gestures of care that weren't connected to requests for financial support or housing security. "What do you want to talk about?" I asked, accepting the coffee but remaining standing near my door rather than inviting her into the living space that Eduardo had helped me choose and furnish during my university years. "I want to talk about forgiveness," she said, her voice carrying the kind of practiced vulnerability that she had used with Eduardo when her business ventures needed additional funding. "I know Carlos and I made mistakes when you were younger. We were so focused on building financial security for your future that we missed opportunities to simply be present and enjoy your childhood." The reframing was masterful. My parents' neglect transformed into noble sacrifice for my ultimate benefit, their absence during my formative years reconceptualized as working to ensure my adult prosperity. But I had learned enough about business and psychology to recognize manipulation techniques that relied on guilt and obligation to override rational decision-making. "Isabela, you weren't building financial security for my future," I replied calmly. "You were pursuing lifestyle opportunities for your immediate gratification while Eduardo provided all the actual security I received. The difference is that Eduardo's investments were in my education, health, and emotional development, while yours were in luxury travel and failed business ventures." Her mask of maternal concern cracked slightly, revealing frustration beneath the performance. "Arianna, you're being unreasonable. We're your parents. We deserve basic respect and consideration, not this cold legal treatment that ignores 25 years of family relationships." "What family relationships?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she was defining connections that had consisted primarily of irregular phone calls and brief visits during fundraising emergencies. "When was the last time you asked about my career, my health, my friendships, my hopes for the future? When was the last time we had a conversation about anything other than money?" The question apparently struck a nerve, because Isabela's response revealed more honesty than she had intended. "We didn't need to micromanage your life because Eduardo was handling all the day-to-day details. We trusted him to keep us informed about your important developments, while we focused on building resources that would benefit our entire family." The admission was devastating, because it confirmed everything the investigation had revealed about their approach to parenthood. They had outsourced their responsibilities to Eduardo, while taking credit for the outcomes he achieved through patient dedication and unconditional love. Tuesday brought Carlos with architectural plans and contractor estimates for property improvements that would supposedly increase the value of our family investments, if only I would extend their housing arrangements for another year while they implemented their renovation vision. Wednesday brought both parents with photo albums documenting every moment they had been present during my childhood, emphasizing their deep emotional investment in my development, while conveniently omitting evidence of all the moments they had been absent. Thursday brought legal threats delivered by their attorney, Dr. Ricardo Mendez, who informed Dr. E. Silva that Carlos and Isabela were prepared to file criminal charges against me for elder abuse, claiming I had manipulated Eduardo during his final years to gain control of assets that rightfully belonged to his son. The criminal allegations are baseless, Dr. Silva assured me, while reviewing the threatening letter that promised prosecution if I didn't voluntarily redistribute the inheritance according to Carlos and Isabela's preferences. But they're clearly hoping that the threat of public criminal proceedings will pressure you into compromise. Friday brought the most desperate strategy yet. Carlos and Isabela arrived at my office with Sebastian, my 8-year-old nephew, who had been coached to plead for his grandparents' housing security, with the kind of innocent emotional manipulation that adults find difficult to resist. "Tia Arianna," Sebastian said with tears in his eyes, and words that were clearly rehearsed. "Vovo and Vovo said you might make them move far away where I can't visit them anymore. Please don't make them leave their homes. I promise I'll be extra good and help them take better care of everything." Using a child as leverage in an adult financial dispute was perhaps the most revealing demonstration of Carlos and Isabela's character. They were willing to traumatize their grandson, with fears of family separation, rather than accept responsibility for the consequences of their own choices. "Sebastian," I said gently, kneeling to meet his eyes while his grandparents watched for signs that their strategy was working. "Your grandparents are moving to a new home because they made some adult decisions that have adult consequences. But they'll still be your grandparents wherever they live, and you'll still be able to visit them." Saturday morning, 48 hours before the final eviction deadline, brought silence. Sunday would bring the end of 25 years of Eduardo's charity toward the son and daughter-in-law who had never learned to appreciate what they were receiving. The eviction proceeded with the mechanical precision of legal consequences that had been 15 years in the making. Court officers arriving at each property with moving trucks and documentation requirements that transformed Carlos and Isabela's comfortable lives into cardboard boxes and storage receipts. I watched from my office window as the Ipanema apartment was cleared of the furniture, artwork, and luxury possessions that had been purchased with Eduardo's money, while they believed they were spending their own inheritance. "All 3 properties have been vacated according to schedule," Dr. Silva reported after receiving confirmation from the court officers supervising the removals. "Carlos and Isabela have retrieved their personal belongings and provided forwarding addresses for any future legal correspondence. The properties are now available for sale or lease according to your preferences." The forwarding addresses revealed the harsh reality of their new circumstances. A modest 2-bedroom apartment in a middle-class neighborhood, far from the luxury accommodations they had enjoyed as charity recipients for over a decade. The rental cost would consume a significant portion of their income, leaving them with lifestyle budgets that matched their actual earning capacity rather than their previous sense of entitlement. "They're renting?" I asked, surprised that Carlos and Isabela had chosen rental arrangements instead of purchasing property with whatever resources they had accumulated during their years of rent-free living. "They applied for purchase loans, but their credit history is problematic," Dr. T.T. Silva explained, reviewing the financial disclosure documents that Carlos and Isabela's lawyers had been forced to provide during the unsuccessful inheritance challenges. Banks found irregular income patterns, high debt-to-asset ratios, and no documented savings despite years of minimal living expenses. The financial analysis revealed what Eduardo had probably suspected, but never stated directly. Carlos and Isabela had been living beyond their means even while receiving free housing, utilities, and property maintenance. Every dollar Eduardo saved them through charitable housing arrangements had been spent on luxury consumption rather than invested in building actual wealth or financial security. The final legal challenges had been dismissed with prejudice, after medical experts testified that Eduardo's cognitive abilities had been superior right up until his death, that the disinheritance process had followed all required legal procedures, and that my inheritance was the result of being present in Eduardo's life, rather than manipulating an isolated elderly man. The judge was particularly harsh in her final ruling, Dr. I.D. Silva said, reading from the court decision that had permanently closed Carlos and Isabela's legal options. She noted that parents who abandon their child-rearing responsibilities cannot reasonably expect to receive the benefits of family loyalty when those responsibilities are assumed by other family members. The judge's written opinion had become part of the public record, creating a legal precedent for disinheritance cases involving parental neglect, and providing a detailed account of Carlos and Isabela's behavior that would be difficult for them to live down in São Paulo's business and social circles. 3 months after their eviction, I received the first genuine communication from Carlos that wasn't connected to requests for money or housing. The letter was brief, handwritten, and carried a tone of defeated recognition that their previous strategies had been based on fundamental misunderstandings of their legal and moral positions. Arianna, the letter began, I am writing to acknowledge that your grandfather was right to protect you from our failures as parents, and that you are right to continue that protection now that you control his legacy. We spent your childhood chasing dreams that mattered more to us than you did, and we have spent these months trying to claim benefits from the father we never chose to be. The admission was perhaps the first completely honest statement Carlos had ever made to me, and it continued with recognition of realities he had spent decades avoiding. We convinced ourselves that providing financial security was the same as providing love, that physical absence could be forgiven if it served larger purposes, and that Eduardo's willingness to fill the gaps we left meant our gaps didn't matter. We were wrong about all of it. And the letter concluded with what might have been an apology, or simply a statement of fact. You deserved better parents than we chose to be, and Eduardo deserved a better son than I chose to be. The inheritance you received was earned through the love you gave and the presence you provided. We have no claim to rewards for work we never performed. 6 months later, I established the Eduardo Montero Foundation for Abandoned Children, funded by 10 million reais from my inheritance, and focused on providing educational support, medical care, and emotional counseling for children whose parents had chosen other priorities. The foundation's first program provided scholarships for children raised by grandparents, recognizing that loving grandparents often save grandchildren from the consequences of parental failures. Carlos and Isabela never contacted me again, perhaps finally understanding that their absence had been a gift to a granddaughter who received better parenting from one devoted grandfather than she ever could have received from 2 reluctant parents. Eduardo's final lesson was the most valuable. Love is not about obligation or blood relationships, but about the choice to be present in someone's life when presence matters more than promises. The 50 million reais would fund that lesson for generations of children who, like me, needed to learn that they were worth more than their parents were capable of recognizing. Justice had been served, and love had won.